Good afternoon, everybody. I'll give you a minute to settle down, the vast multitude here. So I want to welcome everybody here. I also want to welcome everybody who's online. So we're in the new world of hybrid events. And so this is one. And I think, you know, those of you who aren't at Teachers College, this is our Smith Learning Theater. And you can see what a wonderful space this is for these types of events. So welcome, everyone. So welcome to the annual Edmund W. Gordon Lecture at Teachers College. So it's in its 8th year. And since its launch, the lecture has become a high point in our calendar, bringing us speakers such as Gloria Ladson-Billings, Sonia Nieto, Vanessa Siddle-Walker, and Charles Payne. Together with last year's Gordon Lecture by Mary Schmidt-Campbell, today's event bookends Creating a Better World, a series of events at TC celebrating the 100th anniversary of the start of the Harlem Renaissance and the college's special connection to that great artistic and cultural outpouring. Our Gordon lecturer this evening, Lisa Farrington, Associate Dean of Fine Arts and Director of the Howard University Gallery of Art, will discuss the Harlem Renaissance and its legacy in contemporary art. First, however, no introduction to the Gordon Lecture would be complete without describing its namesake, a man whose remarkable life and career and, in his 100th year, his ongoing achievements inspire us in all we do. Dr. Gordon, we are so pleased that you could join us virtually this evening. For 8 decades as a psychologist, minister, community activist, writer, scholar, researcher, and educator of the first rank, Ed Gordon has agitated fearlessly to bring about a smarter, healthier, more equitable, and more just society. And with his wife, Susan Gordon, Ed created one of the first comprehensive clinics in Harlem. During the early 1960s, he served as research director for the Federal Head Start program and helped craft the original Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Through his more than 20 books and hundreds of articles, Ed has put forth his vision of supplementary education, a scaffolding of experience for disadvantaged children that exposes them to the arts, libraries, museums, and all of the other influences that wealthier youngsters take for granted. During the past decade, Ed has increasingly focused on education assessment, arguing that testing should, quote, pay as much attention to the cultivation of ability as the measurement of ability. In June, speaking at TC's Edmund W. Gordon Centennial Conference, he called for affirmative assessment as a key means for providing, quote, appropriate and sufficient opportunities for all children, and especially for those who have been under-resourced, disadvantaged, and discriminated against. It was at that same conference that we announced the renaming of the Institute on Urban and Minority Education, the organization Ed founded in 1973 as the Edmund W. Gordon Institute for Urban and Minority Education. Throughout its existence, the Gordon Institute has been a touchstone for all of TC's work to capture the cause of racial justice and equity. For 30 years, the Institute ran the federally funded Eric Clearinghouse on urban education, helping educators and researchers define and develop the fields of urban education by providing direct information services to parents, community members, and education professionals. More recently, the Gordon Institute and its affiliated faculty have continued to focus on the development of underserved communities, analyzing the impact of supplementary education, youth participatory action research, social and racial justice curriculum and professional development on teaching and learning within and beyond schools. Under the leadership of its current director, Erica Walker, TC's Clifford Brewster Upton Professor of Mathematical Education and past chair of our Department of Mathematics, Science, and Technology, the Institute has expanded into new areas of endeavor, including NSF-funded research on the use of storytelling to facilitate mathematics learning and engagement, work to shape Black education in the wake of the COVID pandemic, and a collaboration to further the study of the African-American diaspora in America's public schools. I should add that Ed Gordon was and continues to be a mentor to Professor Walker, and she herself is a past Gordon lecturer. And now, here to tell you more about our Gordon lecturer this evening is Professor Erica Walker.
Thank you so much, President Bailey. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome and introduce our speaker, Dr. Lisa Farrington. Several years ago, a friend of mine invited me to a talk at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, one of my favorite places. The speaker that night was Lisa Farrington. She was amazing and inspiring, speaking on the artistic world before racism, a compelling presentation of the African diaspora portrayed from antiquity to the present. I never forgot that talk, and I knew that one day I wanted to bring her to Teachers College so that my TC colleagues, students, and friends could learn from her wisdom, her appreciation of beauty, and her expertise. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight in person and online. I want to thank all of our UME staff, especially Veronica Hawley, Angela Gooden, and Sandra Overo, our UME faculty, specifically Callie Waite, and our students, specifically graduate student Deirdre Holloman, for all their hard work helping bring this multifaceted event together. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of the offices of the President and Provost, Nancy Strime in the Office of School and Community Partnerships, Trish McNicholas in College Events for putting this all together for us, Keisha Hayes and Jennifer Mock for their friendship and collaboration with our Harlem Renaissance curriculum guide, and of course, Malik Muftau and Lalitha Vasudevan, and everyone in the Smith Learning Theater and the Digital Futures Institute for their help and support with our beautiful digital exhibits, which are at the front. So I hope you'll have a chance to look at those later this evening. It is the first time that our Gordon Lecture, named as Tom referenced in honor of our beloved professor, Edmund Gordon, has featured a talk about the arts. Long overdue, I'd say. I want to attest that some of the best conversations I've had with Dr. Gordon over the years have been about art, his love for it, his patronage and support for artist friends, and how its beauty inspires and sustains him. Indeed, the covers of his last several books, his 3-volume memoir, and his latest book on diversity in STEM, all feature the work of his friend, the great artist Charles White. When I realized that the centennial of the start of the Harlem Renaissance and the centennial of the birth of the great Edmund Gordon were happening within the same year, it was obvious to me that a Gordon Lecture featuring the arts was indeed very much in order. As I turn to introducing our speaker, I want to first share a little story about one of our TC alumni featured this evening on the walls of the Learning Theater and in our Artist as Educator virtual exhibit just in front there. Alma Thomas, my fellow Georgian, a TC alumna, class of 1934, and a great artist who was based in Washington, D.C., is being prominently celebrated this year with major retrospectives by the Phillips Collection, the Smithsonian, and other museums. I had the chance to visit the exhibition in D.C. earlier this month, and it was incredible. There were many works of art that I had not seen, a documentary featuring Dr. Farrington and others speaking about her life and work, many things that I did not know. And one of the most inspiring was that her work as a professional artist started in earnest after she had retired from a career as a Washington, D.C. public school art teacher, where she was much loved and did incredible things as an educator. Her first major exhibition happened late in life. And as I looked at the exhibit and the soaring work that Alma Thomas created in her 60s, 70s, and just before she died at 81, I was struck by one thing. It's never too late to do anything. It's never too late to do anything you feel passionate about and committed to. It is our hope and dream that our speaker tonight inspires you to do great things. Lisa Farrington's accolades are many, too many to name and do justice here, but I will do my very best. She is Distinguished Professor Emerita at City University of New York and director of the Gallery of Art of Howard University. Dr. Farrington earned a B.F.A. from Howard and then completed an M.A. at American University. She earned an M.A. in philosophy and Ph.D. in art history from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Dr. Farrington has lectured on 3 continents and authored or co-authored 10 books, including 2 award-winning historical texts for Oxford University Press, African-American Art, A Visual and Cultural History, and Creating Their Own Image, The History of African-American Women Artists. We have display copies of these works up front and additional works in the back. And indeed, she was the 2008, in addition, she was the 2008 Endowed Scholar of the Humanities at Spelman College, where we heard from a speaker last year, and won the coveted Creative Capital Writers Award from the Andy Warhol Foundation for her manuscript on African-American artist Emma Amos. On behalf of everyone at the Gordon Institute for Urban and Minority Education and Teachers College, welcome Dr. Farrington, and thank you for sharing your vision with us tonight.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, everyone, for welcoming me. It's a delight to be here. And before I begin, I would like to make a little official PA that some of the images you'll see today may be under copyright, so they shouldn't be reproduced without permission, okay? In New York City, between the wars, African-American visual arts flowered with the same vigor as the fields of drama, music, and literature. For a brief moment in the 20s and 30s, Harlem was the nexus of a visual arts movement, the effects of which were felt across the country and around the world. In places such as Atlanta, Chicago, Kansas City, San Francisco, Paris, and Copenhagen, and in Germany as well, particularly Berlin. For the first time in history, the interests of patrons, dealers, and curators were sparked by African-American art. In 1926, let's see if I can get forgot to do this. So excited to talk to you. In 1926, the Harlem Foundation, which was a philanthropic agency that awarded prizes to African Americans for achievement in the visual arts and other areas, granted the first of many annual prizes to painters Palmer Hayden and Hale Woodruff. And in 1927, the pivotal exhibition, The Negro in Art, was launched by the Chicago Women's Club. Concepts of the so-called New Negro, let's see if I can get that back. There you go. Concepts of the so-called New Negro proliferated, characterized by philosopher Alain Locke. In 1925, the New Negro was someone with renewed self-respect and self-dependence, whose persona found voice in the arts, versus the Old Negro, who was the stereotype that had evolved during slavery. So Locke's sentiments were articulated in this 1925 magazine Survey Graphic in an article that he wrote under the auspices of this magazine's subtitle, Harlem, the Mecca of the New Negro. The magazine, which contained drawings, poems, essays, fiction, and social commentaries by young African-American artists, writers, and intellectuals, sold more than 5,000 copies in 1925. That's a lot of copies. And helped to launch the literary and artistic movement that came to be known as the Harlem Renaissance. This special issue of Survey Graphic, which was not an African-American publication, became the manifesto of the era and included within its pages, in addition to writings, illustrations and portraits of Harlem Renaissance notables and singers such as Paul Robeson, singer-actor, and opera tenor Roland Hayes, who graced the magazine's cover that you're looking at. think after all these years I'd be good at this. The magazine's art director was artist Winold Rice, who emigrated to the US from Germany in 1913 and became known for his documentary-style portraits of Americans from wide and varied racial and cultural backgrounds. Rice's cover design, which we'll look at again, for the Harlem issue of Survey Graphic magazine featured a sensitive portrait of Hayes as the new Negro, and a combination of African and Art Deco design elements. In fact, Rice's cover, with its emphasis on African forms and abstract design motifs, embodied the modern international spirit of the Harlem Renaissance, a spirit with roots firmly planted in both European and African cultures. Many of the Harlem Renaissance artists themselves studied abroad, particularly in Paris, where a counterpart to the New Negro movement, known as negritude, was forming. And they readily incorporated elements of modernist movements such as German Expressionism and Cubism, itself inspired by African sculpture, into their own art. Indeed, the Harlem Renaissance may be considered one of the first truly international art movements to take root on American soil. An unprecedented number of African-American visual artists were able to achieve qualified levels of success during this period, due in no small part to the Harmon Foundation, founded by real estate developer William E. Harmon in 1922. African-American artists gained national and even international reputations with the help of the foundation, whose art prizes and traveling exhibits were designed to bring African-American creativity to the attention of a broad-based public and to lend financial support to minority artists. The winner of the foundation's Gold Medal Prize for Art in 1926, the first year that it gave a prize, and one of the first to benefit from the Harmon programs, was 36-year-old Palmer Hayden. Hayden had earlier spent 10 years in the armed services, during which time he enrolled in a drawing correspondence course. Upon his discharge in 1920, he pursued further art study right here at Columbia University and at the Boothbay Commonwealth Art Colony in Maine. After winning the Harmon Medal and a $400 prize, think $4,000 today, for an impressionistic marine painting, Hayden traveled to Paris, where he lived, studied, and exhibited for 5 years, from 1927 to 1932. While abroad, he made the acquaintance of Elaine Locke, who was traveling in Europe at the time. Locke, the major spin doctor of the Harlem Renaissance and its aesthetics, had received his Ph.D. at Harvard and had the distinction of being the first African-American Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. He also headed the philosophy department at Howard University from 1912 until 1953. Locke's pivotal essay from 1925, The Art of the Ancestors, which appeared in Survey Graphic, and his later essay, Legacy of the Ancestral Arts, urged African-American artists to look to the art of their African ancestors for creative inspiration. Locke argued that modern European art, particularly the works of Modigliani, Picasso, and the German Expressionists, had been influenced substantially by the abstract qualities of African sculpture. And Locke believed that if African art was capable of arousing the aesthetic impulses of the European modernists, then surely, he said, it should inspire the same outpouring of creativity in the quote-unquote culturally awakened new Negro artist. Locke's wish that African art be tapped as inspiration by artists of color found representation in one of Palmer Hayden's best-known works entitled Fétiche et Fleurs, or Fetish and Flowers, which won the Harmon Prize in 1933. The painting comprises a still life of vase of flowers, a Gabon Fang reliquary mask, and a Congo Bakuba textile on the table, all arranged in a Cézannesque design that tilts perspective and compresses space. The artist most closely associated with the Harlem Renaissance was Kansas-born painter Aaron Douglas. Not only did he espouse Locke's ideal of art that embodied African motifs, but he also honored a similar mandate set forth by scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois in a 1915 issue of the NAACP magazine Crisis, which stated that Black artists should depict only ennobling self-imagery. Arriving in New York in 1924, Douglas met Winold Rice, who mentored Douglas and encouraged him to include African abstraction into his own work. Douglas quickly developed a unique method of painting, which combined accessible narrative imagery with a complex compositional substructure of geometric abstraction. His stylized representations of African-American life and history greatly appealed to Harlem patrons and literati. In 1925, Rice included Douglas's illustrations in the Harlem issue of Survey Graphic. The same year, Douglas received commissions to illustrate Opportunity magazine, the publication of the New York Urban League, and Crisis, for which Du Bois was the editor. And in 1927, Douglas collaborated with NAACP co-founder James Weldon Johnson, creating drawings to accompany Johnson's collection of published sermons entitled God's Trombones. A Barnes Foundation Award received that same year allowed Douglas to pursue study of the Barnes collection in Marion, Pennsylvania. This experience and a one-year stay in Paris from 1931 to 32 exposed Douglas to a variety of African art objects as well as to European modernism. The influence of both are revealed in Douglas's mature style, which by the 1930s comprised a synthesis of African and European elements. By this time, Douglas was creating large-scale murals. His most famous mural sequence, right here in New York, is entitled Aspects of Negro Life, and it was produced under the auspices of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and installed at the Schomburg Center in Harlem in 1934, where it remains. The large-scale oil composition comprises a chronological record of 4 critical moments in African-American history. The first panel, which is the one you just saw, African Backgrounds, portrays African dancers, musicians, and ritual objects in an Elysian time before the African slave trade. The second, An Idyll of the Deep South, depicts a time just after Reconstruction, during the age of Jim Crow, when legal segregation and rampant lynching marred African-American life. In this complex narrative is a group of farm workers and banjo players amidst a stylized scene of flora. The figural group is overshadowed on the upper left by the specter of dangling feet. The dangling feet are of a lynch victim whose body is hanging from a tree. Give you a minute to find that. From Slavery to Reconstruction illustrates a scene of enslaved workers behind a screen of cotton plants, men breaking their chains, and a figure holding up a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation in the shadow of the Capitol building. In Song of the Towers, the 4th mural in the sequence, within a towering and industrial setting, Douglas portrays a businessman and a saxophone player, metaphors for the Black creative spirit under the oppressive duress of urban and worker oppression. The composition, a requiem for the proletariat, is crisscrossed with sinister, shadowy forms that haunt the figures, who themselves appear to be overcome by intense emotional anguish. Douglas's inimitable fusion of disparate elements, abstraction and figuration, Africanism and modernism, and social and historical narrative, within the context of his signature lyrical, translucent, and near monochromatic palette, appeared appealed to both the neophyte and the connoisseur. Unlike most social realist and regionalist artists of the age, Douglas was able to embrace abstraction in a way that allowed his paintings to remain accessible to the broader public while yet appealing to the avant-garde. The ready comprehension of his imagery and its dignified Black subject matter made Douglas one of the most popular artists of the period. In fact, 1 year after the completion of Aspects of Negro Life, Douglas was elected president of the Harlem Artists Guild, the Harlem affiliate of the Artists Union, through which he fought for better opportunities for Black artists. Douglas's contemporary, William H. Johnson, was an equally prolific talent. Johnson came to New York from South Carolina in 1918, where he actively pursued visual arts study, taking classes at the National Academy of Design beginning in 1921, and garnering several art prizes and scholarships. He intensified his studies by spending summers at the Cape Cod School of Art in Provincetown, Massachusetts, where his works were included in a group exhibit at the local art association. After studying briefly with the renowned American Ashcan School artist, George B. Lux, in 1926, Johnson relocated to the Montparnasse section of Paris, with funds given to him by the director of the Cape Cod School of Art, Charles W. Hawthorne. Johnson was an exceptional draftsman. His early still lifes and figure studies show a keen understanding of form and of color, and evoke the loose brushwork and spatial analyses of the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. His portraits and landscapes during his first years abroad also demonstrate a proclivity for painterly expressiveness and reveal the influence of artists such as Chaim Soutine and André Derain. In 1930, Johnson entered his work in the Harlem Foundation annual exhibit and was awarded a gold medal for painting. Throughout the 30s, the artist continued to exhibit at the foundation and at numerous galleries, both at home and abroad. In 1937, let's see, this is a real self-portrait. This is who he is as opposed to what he looked like, if that makes sense, you know. In 1937, he returned to the US and took a position with the W.P.A. as an instructor at the Harlem Community Arts Center. At about that time, stylistic changes began to manifest themselves in his work. Under pressure from the Harlem Foundation, which disapproved of Black artists who espoused a European modernist aesthetic, and due to expectations that the broader public had of African-American artists in general, Johnson turned to more deliberately ethnic themes and to a less apparently erudite formal technique. His means evolved away from European modernism and toward a pseudo-naïf style that evoked vernacular art and African sculpture. He also began to focus on African-American religious subjects, genre scenes of Harlem couples, street musicians, and farm workers. Despite the guise of naivete, however, Johnson's later works continued to show a keen sense of composition, an understanding of color and form, and an undeniable gift for complex design. In 1927, the Newark Museum mounted an exhibition entitled Paintings in Watercolors by Living American Artists, a delicately rendered portrait of an elderly woman seated at her sewing table beside a lace-covered, I guess it's sort of like a credenza, was voted the most popular painting in the exhibition. The painter was Chicago artist from the Art Institute, Archibald Motley Jr., and the painting is entitled Mending Socks, a carefully constructed composition portraying Motley's grandmother in near profile within a compressed space. Mending Socks ideally showcased Motley's unquestionable talents, but as an early work that depicted a conventional domestic subject in a naturalistic manner, it was far from indicative of the stylized forms and edgy urban themes for which Motley would become known. Motley's penchant, I don't know if any of you saw a few years ago, the Motley one-man show at the Whitney. Oh, so beautiful. Oops. It's just my glasses, which I'm too vain to put on. So Motley's penchant for realism quickly gave way to a more modernist vision, developed during a year of study in Paris at the end of the 1920s. In his new paintings, Motley generalized figures and faces, simplified forms, and subordinated details in favor of mood-invoking ambiance. He was able to capture the emotional as well as visual impressions of each of his chosen scenes, bringing to life crowded Harlem nightclubs or cobblestoned Parisian streets. He achieved this feat through the use of vibrant colors, diffuse lighting, overlapping forms, and unique angles of vision and handling of space. The results were often visually dazzling. Women artists thrived too during the Harlem Renaissance, not the least of which was sculptor Nancy Elizabeth Prophet, a 1918 graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design, or RISD, and she was attracted by the New York art scene. So Prophet moved to the city after graduation and formed a consequential relationship with Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who was a member of New York's cultural elite and founder of the Whitney Museum of American Art. Whitney and Prophet were fellow artists and, after becoming close friends, shared a studio and exhibited together. In fact, Whitney financed Prophet's first trip to Europe in 1922, where Prophet remained for 10 years, studying and exhibiting throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. Toward the end of her stay in Paris, Prophet began to cultivate her US reputation by sending her works to the 1930 Harlem Foundation exhibit and winning a $250 prize for one of her entries. Returning to the US in 1934, at the invitation of Atlanta University President John Hope, Prophet joined the art faculty at Spelman College, one of the southern magnets for Harlem Renaissance talent. For a time, Prophet's career thrived. Her elegant portraits in wood, marble, and other three-dimensional media were exhibited in major US exhibitions, including both the 1935 and 37 Whitney biennials, and in renowned collections such as the Philadelphia Museum of Art. In 1944, Prophet left her position at Spelman College, finding the segregated Southern environment less than conducive to her urbane sensibilities. Returning to Rhode Island, Prophet made several attempts to further her professional goals. However, she found it impossible to replicate her earlier successes. In order to support herself, Prophet was forced to work as a housekeeper and a live-in domestic servant. Occasionally, she made portrait busts for a ceramics factory, just to earn enough money to pay the rent. But tragically, Prophet's final years were marked by poverty and obscurity. Sculptor Augusta Savage came to New York in the 1920s, like so many others as part of the Great Migration. She was one of the most influential artists of the Harlem Renaissance, making her greatest impact as an educator and an arts activist. After a period of study at New York's Cooper Union and a stay in Europe in the late 1920s, Savage returned to New York in 1932 to establish her own studio of arts and crafts. With aid from the WPA, the studio eventually evolved into the Harlem Community Arts Center, which provided art instruction to some 1,500 constituents and was a model WPA facility visited by Eleanor Roosevelt and Albert Einstein. Included among Savage's students were novices Jacob Lawrence, that's him standing with the white shirt, Norman Lewis, and William Artis, who would go on to become renowned artists in their own rights. In 1939, Savage was offered a professional commission by the organizers of the New York World's Fair to create her sculpture, The Harp, or Lift Every Voice and Sing. This monumental work featured a human harp consisting of singing African-American figures. Unfortunately, at the close of the fair, Savage did not have the funds to store or to cast the 16-foot sculpture in bronze. Here it's painted to appear bronze. As a result, the sculpture was subsequently bulldozed when the fair ended. To make matters worse, Savage discovered that because she had become privately employed, even if only temporarily, she no longer qualified for her WPA position, and her employment with the Harlem Community Art Center, which she founded, was terminated. That year marked the last major showing of Savage's work, and her attempts to further her career were unsuccessful. Her later career offers an uncanny parallel to that of Elizabeth Prophet. The arrested professional progress of both women after the 1930s was due in large part to the cessation of the Harmon exhibitions and to the 1943 demise of the WPA Federal Art Project, which had provided a short-lived season of opportunity to women and minority artists due to its mandates against discrimination, either sexual or racial. The unparalleled opportunities afforded to Black artists during this period were fleeting. As congressional budgets were cut or discontinued, as abstract expressionism began to replace social realism and other narrative art forms, and as socialist sentiments gave way to more conservative values. Savage's genius survived, however, in the art of one of her most prodigious students, who was Jacob Lawrence. His famed Migration series became the object of a bidding war in the late 1930s between the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., and New York's Museum of Modern Art. Today, half of the 40 paintings reside in each museum. Lawrence's work is epitomized by images of Harlem and of Black heroes and heroism. The artists outlined herein represent only a few of those whose lives and ambitions thrived during the years of the Harlem Renaissance. There are many others, such as photographer James Van Der Zee, who created invaluable visual documents of the Renaissance and its players. Other artists include sculptor Richmond Barthet, who studied at the Art Institute of Chicago almost simultaneously with Motley, and who found himself in the enviable position by the early 1930s of having 3 of his elegant and lyrical bronze sculptures purchased by the Whitney Museum. Painter and sculptor Charles Alston became one of the first African Americans to be given a supervisory position by the WPA. Under its auspices, Alston's made murals for the Harlem Hospital. These murals are still there, recently restored. And he opened a studio space at 306 West 141st Street, known affectionately as 306. Alston's atelier became a hub where African-American artists and intellectuals gathered to discuss the pressing issues of the day. There are many more Harlem Renaissance artists who have yet to receive their full due, such as Lois Jones, who created paintings inspired by her knowledge of African masks, or Sergeant Johnson, whose sculptures paid homage to B.F.A. and Benin cire perdue, or lost wax sculptures from the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, and painters James Porter and Melvin Gray Johnson. While important research has been done on many Harlem Renaissance visual artists, numerous others remain unsung. Now, fast forward to the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and we find that the aims and images of the artists of the Harlem Renaissance continue to hold sway over African-American artists. The art of Joyce Scott, for example, engages racial themes in particular. She has demonstrated an idée fixe for watermelon as an index of Black stereotyping. An entire series of her constructions focused on this icon. and features such facetious titles as Aunt Gemellan, a reference to Aunt Jemima, Venus de Melon, a parody of the classic Greek Venus de Milo, and P. Melon #1, a 1995 blown glass construction of anthropoid and vegetal components. Blooming from several leafy layers of pink, green, and white glass and beads blown by the artists, P. Melon offers a forlorn brown countenance encircled by a collar etched with the words, "So juicy." In form and allegory, the structure refers to the literal fruit of watermelon as a racial prosaicism, as well as to feminine or vaginal fruit, the latter of which is emphasized by the sculpture's enlarged pink lips. There is also Scott's Kickanet, which depicts the horrors of lynching as Black tragicomedy. Scott's works of this type, which are at once comic and tragic, illustrate, in Scott's words, her belief that stereotypes can, paradoxically, set you free and clarify your perception of yourself in the world. Faith Ringgold's jazz pictures, which she only did in the last decade or two, encapsulate her own cultural memory of the Harlem Renaissance and its booming jazz scene. Ringgold grew up in Harlem in the 1930s and knew a number of Harlem's musical greats personally. Her work honors the Black artistic genius of the era. David Hammond's iconic African-American flag, now in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, derives from the Harlem Renaissance flag designed by Marcus Garvey as the standard of the UNIA, or the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was one of the most influential political organizations of the Harlem Renaissance. Garvey chose the color green to represent the African continent, black for African skin, and red for the shedding of Black blood during the slave trade. Emma Amos's A Reading at Bessie Smith's Grave honors the creative legends of the Harlem Renaissance by including portraits of Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, Du Bois, and Paul Robeson. While her work entitled Let Me Off Uptown, celebrates the jazz music of the age and Black dancing, as well as the infamous Harlem Renaissance nightclub scene. Frida Hei's postmodern work, Hidden Memories, invokes the subject of Meta Fuller's early Harlem Renaissance sculpture, Mary Turner, which memorializes the ruthless lynching of a Black woman in Georgia and the murder of her husband and unborn child. In Hei's rendering, a vertical beam of white irradiates the abstract symbol of Turner. Barb-like projections evoke the physical agony of her death, and an organic orb corresponds to the infant that was torn from her womb and stomped underneath the feet of her assailants. The same form emits roots, but these are truncated, insinuating the demise of the Turner family line in this one moment. Below the spherical shape, High has outlined what appears to be a commemorative plate and stamped it with a news article describing the shocking violation of Turner that took place a century before she made this painting. Still, other contemporary artists choose to reify Elaine Locke's insistence during the Harlem Renaissance that African-American artists look to the art of their ancestors for inspiration. Willie Cole used found bicycle parts to create an homage to the sacred chihuahua, or antelope, of the Bamana people of Mali. And Alison Saar's Dying Slave refers to the art historical past. With its pose, she extrapolates from Michelangelo's Renaissance sculpture of the same name. But anchoring the solar plexus of her roughly hewn dying slave is the Congo-derived Nkisi cavity used by African sculptors and priests as a receptacle for curative and preternatural substances. SAR's aperture, however, is a shallow crater that denotes injury, suffering, and transcendence, a confluence of vulnerable interior and protective exterior. Indeed, she covers this sculpture's chest with hammered metal so that he seems protected from his own death. Wrist shackles corroborate the work's title, but the splendid physical bulk and vigor of the figure belie its implications with pulsating energy. It's no longer the image of imminent death and slavery. While Michelangelo's sculpture signifies a Neoplatonic enslavement expressed in physical form, SAR's captive, though bound bodily, exudes spiritual and even physical sovereignty, indicative of the tenets of the Harlem Renaissance. Many Harlem Renaissance artists have faded into obscurity, but their legacy has not. The Black painters and sculptors of the 20s and 30s constitute a remarkable group of talents who overcame a variety of barriers and obstacles to achieve a lofty goal, that of reconstituting the negative image of Blacks in America to something positive. They succeeded against the odds and continued to influence subsequent generations of African-American artists. The racial, economic, and socio-political impediments that African-American artists faced in the Harlem Renaissance in pursuit of their chosen vocations were profound. Yet the idiosyncratic circumstances of the age, which allowed for a flowering of Black aesthetic genius, caused Americans to sit up and take notice for the very first time of African-American creativity. Thank you so much. I think we're going to have a Q&A. We are going to transition to the Q&A. So, okay.
It's a little bit of a step up.
I have high heels. That's the thing.
Oh, I'm in flats and managed to that. Okay. Let's see. So, are we on?
Mhm.
Okay, great. I want to look at you and look at my notes at the same time. So we're not on. Really?
Hold it very close. Hold it very close to
All
your
right,
mouth.
there we go. I usually am just loud as opposed to using microphone. I hear the chuckles back there. People know me in here. So first of all, let me say thank you so very much. And I'm really happy to have been asked to respond to what you presented. And I also have a set of note cards here that I'm going to get to. But before I get...
Mike.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay.
You practically have to kiss.
I am.
Okay.
I am. What I wanted to focus on, and especially to address the audience about, is that the work is not only enlightening and thought-provoking, but you took us on an amazing journey that really tells the story of African-American history in a very different way. And to that end, I want to emphasize the importance of this work, not just its beauty and its entertainment, but the importance of this work to African-American history and to American history as well. And perhaps self-servingly so, it is wonderful to delve into the humanities. And as Dr. Walker said at the beginning of this talk, it's something that we often forget, especially in this time. So truly appreciated everything that you had to say and all of the wonderful historical references. And there was a beauty in the way that you brought in so many people that those who study African-American history know and take for granted. And I'm hoping we get to a point where we are able to not have people take notes and look up who they are, but that it is really an important part of the whole dialogue. So I have a number of questions here, and we have a very short time. And because it is a school of education, I'm going to start with a question that gets at how do educators who are developing Black history curriculum, what would you say are the most important pieces of the Harlem Renaissance art, especially in K through 12 education, that might be included as part of those curricula?
Well, while I focused almost exclusively on visual art, obviously literature already gets some attention, but the visual arts are something that children in K through 12 are really connected to. You know, they haven't yet lost interest in painting and drawing and coloring. And so, if I may, I wasn't planning on doing this, but I was for many years on the board of a foundation which still functions very actively today, called the Anyone Can Fly Foundation. It was founded by artist Faith Ringgold. And that foundation gives awards once a year to K through 12 teachers who prepare curriculum for teaching about the history of African-American artists. And that curriculum focuses on the great masters, their struggles to become artists, and their styles of painting. And so while today focused almost exclusively on the Harlem Renaissance, there are great masters that could be included in such a curriculum from the 19th century. Landscape painters, Duncanson and Bannister. Duncanson from the Ohio Valley, Bannister also from RISD. They were award-winning, internationally renowned painters of landscape in the 19th century. And then, of course, the marble sculptor, Edmonia Lewis. If you don't know her, you absolutely should. One of her sculptures, well, several of her sculptures, of course, are here in the United States in the Smithsonian and so forth, but one of her sculptures was discovered not so long ago at a museum, which used to be a kind of an abbey in Scotland. And about a month ago, there was a wonderful session, because she lived most of her life in Europe, on her work, this Head of Christ in Scotland. So African-American artists seem to be getting a lot of attention overseas, possibly more than they're getting here. And so we might want to catch up.
And along those same lines, I was curious to know, as you were talking about the various influences, were Harlem Renaissance artists, while we know about the European connection and the importance of that art in other countries, was it as popular in the United States contemporary, in that contemporary time? It's sort of what you're talking about now. There's less attention to African-American artists and art currently. Was that the case in the during the Renaissance? And also, where I was starting was, how much influence did the African continent have in terms of travel? I know expats went to Europe, but did people also spend time in Africa?
No. In the 20s and 30s, most African-American artists were traveling to Europe. The travel to Africa, where artists really got engaged, began in the 1960s. When Festac started, and every so many years, the African Arts Cultural Festival in Dakar and in Nigeria. So in the 20s and 30s, artists were not going to Africa. I know that Hale Woodruff went to Africa, but that was for a job. He was working on a railroad or something. But they weren't going there to get their exposure to African sculpture. They were looking at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, which had the African sculpture. They were looking at the Museum of Modern Art, because they had a big African sculpture exhibit in 1935. And they were looking at the Marion collection, the Barnes collection in Marion, Pennsylvania, which Albert Barnes collected a huge amount of African sculpture, and he exhibited it in his mansion next to the Picassos and the Modiglianis that were influenced by that African sculpture. That's where Aaron Douglas was exposed to African sculpture. Lois Jones saw African sculpture in Paris at the Musée de l'Homme. They were not going to Africa, not then.
Okay, great, thanks. And then I'm curious to know, you talked a lot about the WPA, and for those who know anything about American history and all of those New Deal programs, they were often very much segregated and resources weren't necessarily available for African Americans in any profession. So when the WPA ended its funding, how did that affect artists? And is there anything similar to that currently, that type of funding that's available that is so generative?
Well, when the WPA ended, mostly because President Roosevelt passed away and that kind of funding was considered, socialist or communist, nothing really replaced it. The Atlanta University annuals was one example of an effort to start annual exhibits that would kind of replace the lost Harmon exhibits and the lost WPA exhibits. But that was not as cross-cultural, if you will, as some of the Harmon and WPA shows. And then today, I think of the equivalent of the WPA would be the GSA, which has a huge art component, and they're constantly commissioning artists to do all those giant public sculptures that you see, and quite a few African-American artists benefit from GSA commissions.
Great, thanks. And can you GSA is?
Government Services
Okay.
Administration. General Services Administration, thank you. Was that you, Mr. Long? I have a lot of friends in this audience, it's nice.
And new friends as well,
And-
so it's
and new
really,
friends
it's
as
really
well.
great. So I wanted to connect what you do to your current position in curating for the museum.
Mhm.
In a sense, this is a very difficult and aspirational question, but how do you spread the influence of the museum, your work, and the arts, either throughout schools or have it not just be a Howard thing or a Harlem thing? Do you have any ideas about that or anything more to say?
Yes, well, HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, many of them have substantial collections of African-American art that are almost only seen in the environment of the university. And these universities like Spelman College Spelman has a museum, Hampton has a museum, but most of these institutions don't have large spaces to show their work, and they really need one. I'm working desperately now to get a space like that at Howard. And so right now, there is a group called Art Bridges, which is out in Arizona, an extension of Crystal Bridges Museum. And they are working very hard to take works of art from HBCU collections that don't get seen and arrange for them to travel around the country. So institutions, foundations that do that sort of thing, that's really helpful. You said something else there. Oh yeah, so how do you get it out, right? So the other thing is lending. I mean, one of the major things that happens at HBCU Art Gallery is lending your work to other shows. So we've had works in the Virginia Museum, works in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts and the Phillips Collection. Coming up, opening in March, the famous Edmonia Lewis sculpture from the 1860s, Forever Free, will be one of the centerpieces of a show that's about to open at the Metropolitan Museum on the sculptor Carpeaux and images of slavery. That is going to be a major exposure of a sculpture that people have seen pictures of, but they haven't seen the real thing from an HBCU collection. So lending art, traveling exhibitions, all of these, those two things, and of course, reproduction of works of art in catalogs and magazines, and we do that a lot too. That all is helpful.
Thank you so much. I'm struggling here with a question, and I think I'm going to have to sort of break protocol and ask the person who has written this question. Why don't you come up here and I'll give you the microphone so you can ask the question.
First of all, thank you very much. I think you did a wonderful, masterful job. And my question, as you and I have met over the years, I'm the grandniece of Henry Ossawa Tanner. And
Hold on, just clap for that, okay? Henry Tanner is, bar none, the greatest, considered the greatest African-American artist ever. So we're in the presence of royalty.
thank you. I know that your charge, your mission, which you did superbly, was the Renaissance. But I didn't want people who don't know the art history, and I have lived all my life and you have lived, that it began way back. And that the struggles that Tanner, as you know, Locke said to him, please continue to do the Black images. And as you know, he left the United States in 1891 and went to Paris. Actually, he went to London first, but we all say Paris. And he lived there, and his works were in, now today, they moved from the Louvre, and they now are in the Musée d'Orsay. And one of my dearest friends was Romy Bearden, and Romy used to say that it would not be possible for the artists of his day, meaning Romy, Lawrence, etc., if it had not been for Tanner who paved the way. Now let's move to 2021. The struggles that Tanner had in racism, leaving the United States, moving away from Black images. Then we had the period that you talked about. But today, I wanted to ask you a loaded political question. Who makes the decisions about what goes on the wall? Who are these people? Who determines what the prices are? Why don't we have a Black curator at the Metropolitan Museum? Why is it whiteness? And some Blacks make decisions, but they leave out the baby with the bathwater.
Wow.
Thank you very
Okay,
much.
everything just said is absolutely true. And my personal contribution to correcting this problem is that 2 years ago, I launched the idea of a museum studies specialty in HBCUs and at Howard, and that students are going to be trained to become curators and museum specialists at university level at HBCUs. And Howard has partnered with the National Gallery of Art, which got a $500,000 grant to help fund this program. The Phillips Collection, which takes our interns, and the Whitney Museum, which has been training our interns, 3 or 4 other museums. So in my opinion, the way to correct that problem of who makes the decisions is to train young art historians and museum educators to become viable candidates for museum work. And because right now there's this like pitiful amount, like minus 0% of people of color in the field of museum curatorship. So that's one step. There's actually a lot more movement, and has always been since the 30s, in Black-owned galleries and so forth. But it is also a financial issue. It's an entrenched history of white American patrons who have the money and who open the galleries. But I have to say, right now, we're having something very similar that occurred in the 30s. That, for a variety of very complicated reasons that you alluded to, gallery dealers are asking scholars like myself to curate exhibitions for them and to bring Black art into their galleries. I'm going to mention specifically one of the first galleries in the United States to show Black art. It's not a Black-owned gallery, it's ACA galleries. They were showing African-American art in the 1930s. It's still family owned. They're still doing it today. And they have invited me to curate an exhibition on African-American women artists for September. So it's got to be a collaborative effort. But it has to be approached from multiple sides. So the ground up is to lure African-American young people into the field. And then from top down, it's to make engagements with the powers that be and make sure that these artists are seen. And it does happen, and it happens more often than not. I'm a little more optimistic than you. So we'll just keep fighting the good fight.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you so much for your question and the answer that sets us up for the future. I think we're going to stop our Q&A there, but I do want to urge everyone as you were taking notes through this, one, definitely buy the books and educate yourself to be able to educate others. And I want to stress again how important arts and the humanities are to our everyday existence and to who we are as people. This is crucial. And so I appreciate you so much for coming to talk, and Yumi and Dr. Walker as a mathematician recognizing the importance of art. And so I'm going to turn the microphone over to our provost, Stephanie Rowley, for closing comments. Thank you again, and thank all of you.
This conversation. So I have three things to do before I actually get to my comments. First, I just wanted to say hello to Dr. Gordon, joining us remotely. He is our professor, our colleague, collaborator, and certainly an inspiration for tonight's events. Thank you to him. Second, I wanted to say thank you to Dr. Walker for this incredible event. Just looking around the room, this is really a special moment, especially for us to all be here in person. And I am so personally grateful that Dr. Walker has given me some tours of some of our New York art galleries and introduced me to so many of our TC amazing Black artist alum. And so if you get a chance to do the private Erica Walker tour, it's fantastic. So thank you. And again, just for this amazing, beautiful setup in the Smith Learning Theater here tonight. I'm mostly here, though, to say thank you to Dr. Farrington for really just brilliantly bringing this together and explicating the Harlem Renaissance as not simply a moment in history, but rather, like all great movements, a convergence of original thinkers and perspectives that resonate for each new generation. So thank you. That's certainly true at Teachers College, where, as President Bailey mentioned earlier, TC has a special connection to the Harlem Renaissance through a group of really remarkable alumni who are closely associated with the movement. Artists, scientists, and thinkers like Aaron Douglas, Charles Alston, James Lesesne Wells, Alma Thomas, May Edward Chin, and Gertrude Colby were revolutionary in contributing to the new ways of thinking about the arts, science, politics, and social action. President Bailey also mentioned that over the past year, TC has been celebrating the centennial of the start of the Harlem Renaissance. We're proud to have supported the work of the Office of School and Community Partnerships, the Gordon Institute for Urban and Minority Education, in curating symposia, book talks, lectures, and other events this year to celebrate this incredible movement of ideas and to explore its legacy through TC. As but one example, the Gordon Institute collaborated with Columbia's Wallach Gallery and Double Discovery Center to design a curriculum guide for teaching the Harlem Renaissance in contemporary times, free and downloadable with resources created by TC faculty like Judy Burton and Jackie Simmons, a host of TC students and alumni and community partners. As we've enjoyed this evening, we have visual reminders of these amazing artists and their work surrounding us here in the Smith Learning Theater. As Dr. Walker pointed out, you should check out the exhibits at the front. I'd like to highlight just a few more TC alumni
In addition to the great Alston, Douglas, and Thomas, who we've heard about this evening, Gertrude Colby, a pioneer in dance education, studied at TC and later joined TC's faculty. Through her innovative work with children at TC's Speyer School, one of the nation's early community schools, she developed a creative approach to dance instruction called natural dancing. Many leading dance educators studied with her at TC. Charles Williams was the founding director of the Hampton Institute Creative Dance Group, so speaking of our HBCU connections, the first national touring company composed of college students and one of the earliest groups to perform African dance, spirituals, and modern dance in U.S. venues. Williams used African diaspora themes in his modern dance choreography. He employed Haitian and African religious dance forms, as well as Negro spirituals and plantation dances such as the juba and the cakewalk. Also, TC claims major Harlem Renaissance figures in literature and medicine. The poet and fiction writer Gwendolyn Bennett celebrated Black culture and Black America's African heritage. Bennett served on the editorial staff of Opportunity, a journal of Negro life, which chronicled cultural advancements during the Harlem Renaissance. With Zora Neale Hurston, Aaron Douglas, and John Davis, Bennett was a co-founder and editor of the journal Fire, which, while short-lived, is considered one of the Renaissance's high watermarks. The physician May Edward Chin was a talented pianist who accompanied Paul Robeson. After changing her TC concentration from music to science, she became the first African-American woman to graduate from the university and Bellevue Hospital Medical College. She practiced medicine in Harlem for 50 years, during much of which she was the area's only Black female physician. Chin became a member of the New York Academy of Sciences and received a citation from the New York City Cancer Committee of the American Cancer Society. I said a moment ago that the ideas and ideals of the Harlem Renaissance live on today. For example, look no further than our own professor, Edmund Gordon, who, like many of these artists and thinkers that I've been talking about, knew and was inspired by the great sociologist and Pan-Africanist W.E.B. Du Bois. As we close our Gordon lecture today, all of us should reflect on how incredibly fortunate we are to have Professor Gordon in our midst, both as a living link to history and as a continuing source of ideas that will stand the test of time. Thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful evening.